Hey, this is Christian Buckley with another Microsoft Buzz Chat, and I'm here today with Mr. Mark Kashman. Hey, Mark.
Well, hello, Christian. How are you wherever you are? I think you're back home, but I think last I saw you, you were here in the Pacific Northwest.
Yes, it's I went. It was, I think, warmer out there. I was trying to remember the weather. I didn't go outside much while I was there. We had SharePoint Fest conference going on, and
Yeah,
just a busy
the
week.
the weather inside the Washington State Convention Center was amazing.
Yes, yeah, it was excellent. What I find is conference center weather patterns are very similar around the world. People don't know that. Think
It's
about that.
very true. I think there's a white paper in that.
Yeah, we'll do some research. We'll pull up some data. But it's great for you to join us. For those that don't know, Mark, why don't you introduce yourself? Give us some of the background, what you're focused on now, but maybe even a little bit of the history, what led you into this role, and what you're focused on.
Yeah, so currently I'm focused on both SharePoint and OneDrive, primarily what we're doing for collaboration. So on sort of that left-hand side of the spectrum as you're working through things with the nitty-gritty, collaborating with other people. Our integration with Microsoft Teams, I sort of own that component. Once we start building new, I make sure everybody knows about it. I'm also doing some of what our friend Bill Bear used to do, because Bill has now moved holistically over to Microsoft Search and AI-powered experiences. So some of what he was doing around migration, some of what he was doing obviously with on-premises connections and hybrid,
I heard
I'll be
that
taking.
rumor. I wasn't sure if it was like all dumped over on you, or as some of the admin capabilities that Bill owned, is it spread out across the team, or?
So if you know Bill, anybody knows Bill, he was managing probably about 6 main areas. He was doing SharePoint Spaces, he was doing search, on-premises, hybrid, some of our migration efforts, just a lot of things. And obviously admin. The way that Microsoft 365 marketing is now structured, or got a little restructured, and where Bill landed was obviously kind of no longer SharePoint, which is a little weird to say out loud.
It is
But
weird.
some of what he was...
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you've known Bill for as long as I have or more, and but he's still certainly connected into SharePoint from a search perspective. We're one of his main entry points.
I'm sure
Um,
he'll throw in and answer questions that are out on the interwebs as they surface as well. That's Bill. If he knows the answer, he'll try and help out as well.
oh yeah, Bill jumps in, Bing jumps in, SharePoint jumps in, OneDrive jumps in. Everybody's jumping in when it comes to search. Um, So some of what he was doing for admin actually is now being taken over by the broader admin motions, of which we have a team that's dedicated to the Office 365 admin. So you can imagine, anything you would administer for SharePoint would be a part of what a cloud admin would do.
Which just makes sense, right? Yep.
Yeah, and so he got piece parted, in a few places. I got a few things. Chris McNulty got a few things. Some other team members, picked up spaces to help out as that transitions possibly over, to an even greater scenario beyond SharePoint, or where it would fit, not just the scenario itself.
Right.
So anyway, that's how things work. So I've gotten a few new responsibilities, primarily SharePoint for collaboration, OneDrive all up, and some of this migration and admin. Before that, just sort of the how did I get here, I've actually been doing SharePoint from a marketing perspective. I was the first SharePoint online product manager. This was as we stopped doing spinning up of a VM on a desktop so that we could show you SharePoint on premises. It was my first job to crack open a web browser and show you SharePoint online, which was much easier for the laptop they had to give to me. It was a much smaller laptop with a smaller brick. I didn't have to carry around a server.
It probably weighed
But
5 times as much, though.
yeah, it was still bigger than my Surface Pro is
Yeah.
now,
Yeah.
but it definitely was the smallest laptop on the team, and I literally could just open a browser and start to do my demos versus warming up a VM and getting all those demos going.
Well, what was the time frame? What was the time frame for that, Mark? Because when I was joined Microsoft back in 2006, so back before it got renamed as BPOS into, and
Yep.
So that was all of the dedicated online pieces, and I left just as the team got rebranded as Office 365 and went over into AdOps.
Yeah, it's just a couple of years before we rebranded to Office 365. So SharePoint Online obviously already existed before we got the name Office 365. BPOS was the name, the suite. And up until the point before I joined, they really had managed it as a suite without any real specifics, with dedicated headcount for people to actually market the cloud. Because at that point, we were really just talking about what is SharePoint in a hosted fashion.
Right.
We had our
There was all the
dedicated
small
offering.
business server solutions and all that stuff that was all still out there. And
Yeah, it just was a very kind of one-to-one ratio, but more when I started was, what is the cloud not? And that wasn't to ding SharePoint Online. That's just the realities of moving from product to service took a number of years. And even through the rebrand of BPOS to Office 365, SharePoint Online to become a service, to me really started to hit around 2013. And as we moved into the 2016 era of on-premises, we actually started to flip. That's when we started to actually pull the code that we were putting into the service and cut a version for on-prem, which is also what we did for SharePoint Server 2019. But the foundation in the cloud that we really have grown and in some respects surrounded in SharePoint Online with just a ton of other automation tools and scale and reliability and all of the security, doesn't mean that what is on premises is any lesser than. It's just there's a whole host of things that go into online. Included in that, a lot of my role then became was what is now not just different about online, but what's new in online. So we shifted actually to a standard product manager role. But ways back it was working very closely with the Exchange team,
Yep.
at the time the Link team, of course the Office team, and it's sort of what is this package, BPOS. And before that, my role just coming into that was I was building a solution on top of SharePoint, like you and many others in our community, but internally within the services organization. And that was called the Interactive Media Manager, which was essentially adding additional digital asset management capabilities, mostly the metadata store,
Mm-hmm.
on top of SharePoint. So we were adding, a pretty robust asset management metadata store and working closely with about 3 or 4 partners for a complete solution. So SharePoint was still our cornerstone. Where do you log in? Where do you fill out a form and submit and get things going? But it also became an orchestration engine through the capture of metadata, the capture of video, and of course the ultimate delivery through signage and other video editing systems and tons of things that people could build off of that.
Right.
But it's with that, per my previous role before that, which was in internal field training. If you know Arpan Shah from a long ways ago.
I do, over in Azure now, yeah.
Yeah, based on what I was doing with IMM and the work that I had done with him as a subject matter expert, capturing his, pre-SharePoint days, I got the call from Arpan that said, hey, we think you'd be a good fit for the product manager role for SharePoint Online. And that is essentially still my title, with some more responsibilities and a couple of level increases over the years, which, they still like what I do, and I still like what I do too.
Well, it's nice being part of, especially just in a work for a software company with so many other products, and you see you're there long enough, you see the end of life of a lot of these little products, and SharePoint has been one where it's been a good long run that's continuing, and just a lot going on. So it's nothing wrong with staying in a role and loving what you do. And of course, now you more recently, besides these recent changes with the reorg and taking on some of Bill's work, good luck with that. But more recently, you took over the OneDrive components as well, because has it been 2 years? It's been less than that, right?
Yeah, I've dipped into OneDrive before, and that was just mostly in a transition when we were hiring a new person. But in this recent restructuring of our marketing, we do have a dedicated person to OneDrive for Business. Her name is Ankita Kurti. And we also have on the consumer side somebody dedicated to that. So I've sort of taken on a mentor role / anytime we have the big announcements, big disclosures, big events, on stage, and just managing, across so that we can tell this dual use, working with the Windows team when we talk about, what is our value in Windows. There's a couple of things that now across 3 people, we've spread how we market OneDrive. And I've just been sort of, I think in the essence of no new title, entered into this role of being lead for OneDrive, working with Ankita and Paul.
Yeah, well, that's cool. I mean, because I see your name out there as around blog posts that go through and share across these things, and and you and I've had this conversation, a number of times in the last 2 years, that Microsoft across the board has gotten much better at the frequency and the quality of just of information that's being shared about what's going on. The visibility level's gone way up. Now, we always say that the SharePoint community, a lot of why it grew and was so robust for such a long time, really kind of the core to go to the root analysis was that the lack of documentation and visibility into what was going on. And so we kind of had to help each other and build that up. Microsoft is doing a great job there, but I think it's also really expanded from the community as well. You are seeing more and more content and videos and actions and partnering between Microsoft and community members around the content. I know you're very involved with that as well. You've been doing the IntraZone podcast for how long now? You're at episode 30.
Yeah, we're just touching on episode 36.
Yep.
That will release very soon. If I look at my watch, I can see that it's coming up soon. So we've got 37 episodes that are primarily broad or narrow topic type episodes, and we also do once a month a bonus episode that's fully focused on the roadmap. So here is everything that shipped this month. And within those episodes, we usually talk to somebody from the program side of things, program management side of things, that it's actually engineering the feature. How did they go about it? How did they design it? And of course, I get to work with my friend Chris McNulty and a ton of guests. So I know the value of doing a podcast. I know the now selfish value of the podcast is I get to stay plugged in with MVPs, our customers, and our internal teams proactively, because I get to reach out to them and say, hey, I'd love to work on an episode about X or Y, or we get a request from people saying, I'd love to hear about whatever. And so it's a nice mechanism for me to stay plugged in, but it's actually turned out to be a really nice marketing tool, for people to listen as they go on vacation, or they go for a walk, or as they're driving home in their commute. We try to keep it short. We're kind of at the hour length typically, but we're mindful for our monthly episodes, that are these roadmap oriented, to keep those under 30 minutes. And it's just one of those great things to work on. It seems to be well received so far. And if people don't know about it, definitely check out the IntraZone. It's at aka.ms/theintraZone. And
I was just about halfway through before this time. I was listening to the FAQs.
Yeah, excellent.
So that's a lot of production work on that one, because it's snippets, from across.
Yeah, we had this great asset where we got a lot of good and sometimes tough questions at the SharePoint conference. It's at the AMA that we did at the end. And we had a number of our engineers up on stage to field the questions. And it was just one of those things I'd been staring at for a while, thinking, we haven't yet published this.
Right. Yeah.
We may not publish it as is, but they were okay with me going in and cherry picking, so it wasn't too long of an episode. And I didn't want to play it just verbatim, so that, I think the mindfulness of a good podcast, or as I'm learning, is just get to the point, but obviously keep what's interesting. And so, we just removed a little bit of the fluff. We've got a great behind the scenes team that we're, taking the cues and editing it so it sounds good. And then we recorded the bits that we needed and got it out there. I was actually really happy how that episode turned out. And it's one of those agile marketing, we're getting pushed to create lots of content, not just podcasting, but to repurpose things, especially if it was a pretty narrow audience who might have heard it initially, to try to get it out to folks that didn't attend the SharePoint conference. And one of the bigger pushes with the podcast is to, get some folks that maybe aren't currently fans of SharePoint, aren't aware of some of the things that we're doing most currently, and making it a really easy touch where it's a really low investment on their end.
It's having worked with with training and doing this kind of presenting for a long time, and different people, different personalities, you consume information in different ways. And so if you're only providing blog content, only providing feature articles, or even only video or audio, any one channel, it's not sufficient to reach the audience. You really have to think about, how do we multi-purpose this information. So just like I do with these, this is designed as a vlog. There's a video component if you're listening to the podcast, but I simulcast it over onto the podcast and try to have at least a couple episodes a week. So this is of the Microsoft Buzz Chat. I think this is episode number 5, but I'm almost to 70 of the MVP
Ooh.
Buzz Chat.
Yeah,
I've been
that's
doing that
great.
for a couple of years.
Yeah,
And
I would have pointed right back at you and said you are essentially the guru. And I also think in that same vein, Mike Gennady,
yeah,
of creating a lot of content, putting it out there in multiple ways, so that people can consume it, and keeping the spectrum of you're not just always talking about one topic. That is
yeah.
the
Well,
biggest learning.
what's interesting, so I had a conversation at SharePoint Fest last week with Sue Hanley in the hall. We were talking about like how we learn, and she said something that's exactly the same way, where I often, I can go and watch videos, I can read things, but it's often not until I'm sitting down and writing through, putting in my words what the activity is. So like building content, that actually helps. That's where it clicks for me and where I start to understand that. And so I very much understand, like I still need to do the reading. I need to touch it, get my hands dirty, play with the technology to
Yep.
understand it and be able to talk to it. But for me, it's the writing more than anything that it's why I go in and do that. It's almost an extension of, as I'm learning, let's learn together as I'm going through this experience. So it's great to hear that other people have that same experience. But it goes back to a conversation I had a few years back with somebody in the community who said, well, he was criticizing me. He wasn't like openly just straight like criticizing me for it, but he was in a
How
roundabout
dare
way.
he? Who is this person? I'll
Well,
get him.
for writing an article that
You tell me who this is.
that somebody else had already written an article on, and he's like, it's the definitive article. Why do you need to write on that? And my response was, well, for one, he doesn't have my voice, my experience. I relate it in different ways. I different perspectives on that, different customer experiences. I have different audience than he does,
Yeah, that's a
and
big one.
all those different things. And when you're creating content, no matter what the medium, the biggest barrier to moving forward and where writer's block comes from is that self-editing. And one of the things that you need to do is, if you're not comfortable with writing, do a podcast, do a video, create more content out there. And I think it all benefits. We need to have good filters for that information, ways to find that. But don't think that, hey, somebody else has already done this topic. Get out there,
Yeah.
share your view.
I will tell you, one of our nightmares just in general, and I would say probably for anybody in marketing or sales, is when you talk to somebody and they haven't heard X or Y that you thought you were pretty loud and proud about, that you put it out there and how could you not have seen it? If you're asking the question, you should have seen it. But the reality is we don't own all channels. We aren't always perfect at distributing it to all channels. And hey, if there is a channel, a blog, a podcast, a reference in a chat with a conversation live or, in some tool that references, points to, or at least says the same exact thing, I am deeply in gratitude because that's just one other area where maybe we didn't think to go or wouldn't have gone. And, I love starting conversations that said, I heard about X and Y, tell me more, versus, yeah, that caught me by surprise. I never heard about that. I wish I would have known. So I think, when you think about other people picking up things or you're giving your own slant on something, I don't think that would ever be a bad thing, especially when you're wanting to get, some information out there, if not significantly out there. That is always very welcome.
It's funny. It's one of the reasons why I started the CollabTalk Tweet Jam, which I've been doing since January of 2012, almost
I
every
think you had
month
one
since
this
then.
morning.
There was one today, yes. But it was to get out of the echo chamber, to get other voices in there so that I could be familiar with, get to know other people, other levels of expertise, get their input on stuff. And I love that, getting that perspective. And sometimes just not trying to answer what I think I know about a topic, but just to listen and ask additional kind of refining questions right there in real time. So I always learn so much from these sessions, and that's the other thing I love is when I hear back from people, if I do write something or present something and people come up and said, or said, hey, you know what, there's this great link And I'm not talking about, hey, here's a link to my white paper that people download for the product that we're selling that's related to what you're talking about. Like, not those. Those are
Yeah.
inevitable. We're going to get them. But when people come up and says, hey, I blogged about this last year, I'll send you a link and the experience that I went through, some of the difficulty that I have with the solution that you just ran past very quickly. I'm like, love it. Love citing those, pointing people to these other assets that are out there. So always welcome that.
Yeah, my one example that I still point people to is one of our community members, Mikael Svensson.
Yep.
I
Mikhail
can't get his last
Svensson.
name right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know
Yeah.
Mikael.
Yeah.
And he wrote a great blog post about how to take a communication site and through a PowerShell command enable external sharing. And I will say from the Microsoft perspective, we support that. We want people to use SharePoint sites for external use, if it's broad external use, or like you and I had a session where we were just talking about bringing people in as guests to your site and content. But specifically for communication sites, we don't have the actual toggle UI for a site owner to be able to go and do that. But we support it if external sharing is enabled by IT. Michael wrote out a really nice blog post that describes exactly how to do it, and it's in a very supported fashion. He was ahead of the game before we documented it. And, I'm just as happy to point to his blog post. Sometimes I get the feedback like, hey, you're pointing me to a third-party blog, and it's like, yeah, because it's up, it's right, and I'm at least telling you it's supported. So it's a great asset. And it's very succinct, just gets right to the point. I think it's hopefully one example, like you were saying, where, pointing somebody to the right resource, or if I were to have, written a little thing and then, hey, go check out Mikhail's blog, I think that's very valid and very necessary.
There's an old movie. I don't remember what it is, but it's like New York City Christmas, and I used to know the name of the movie, but it's just kind of a famous movie where somebody comes in and the manager of this department store is like, oh, we don't have that, but our competitor across the street, I know that they have that, so I'll send you over there to go and do that. That's always been as a business owner, as a technical evangelist for some of the ISVs within the SharePoint community, I was never afraid to say, no, look, we don't do this, or we don't do this piece well, and what you really need is this one from our competitor. Great example, back when I was with Exceller and doing migration, and people would come in and ask about doing like file share migrations, and we built out our file migration tool, but when we didn't have one, I'd point people over to Quest all the time. And likewise, we had a friendly, co-opetition relationship, and they would point back on other things to one of our products. And we just kind of had this, this unofficial rule of, hey, we were not going to go in and try and steal the clients on these other things. But, when we had a client that had a need, what we try to do is solve that need. And I've always had that perspective. Again, go back to the Tweet Jam. My first, Tweet Jam, I had invited people and had participate people from Quest and Metalogics and AvePoint and then with Exceller and all these, and it was great to have all those voices. We were all friends anyway. No matter what the salespeople were doing in the background. But that's a great philosophy that I think is also part of I would say, is a part of the cultural change with Microsoft, where if there wasn't an official answer, Microsoft would not answer or provide the non-answer that was in the documentation. And it was incredibly frustrating sometimes. Versus hey, here's what this is what this person in the community, this is a workaround that they found, and be able to leverage that we don't have this officially supported yet, or it's not there. Here are some options for you.
Yeah, from both a product perspective and a community perspective, I would say, I don't know what the exact ratio is. We always say at 1 to 7. One of what we do is really 7, times of what other people are contributing or providing as far as solutions. Some of that you can see, easily in the community. There's just a wealth of information that people put out there. And even though I don't have a great competitor type example for the space that I work in, because we usually don't point to other competitors, just not to be silly, but it's sort of a weird space. However, if you look at what we're doing with the new Chrome experience within Edge, we're pretty public about how we're leveraging that technology so that Chrome can get better. And I think they just recently pushed information of what we were either working on or had found something that would boost performance that we then shipped to them for them to put into the base of Chrome. That of course would benefit, as it came back into Edge, but also benefits anything that leverages that same base engine. So there's a lot of great synergies, obviously, when it's right to cooperate, when it's, co-opetition is always interesting, and competitive natures or just general notions of being aware of what other people are doing is never a terrible thing. And I think, the new Microsoft certainly is very competitive, very open in terms of sharing, and certainly, when we're not sharing, it's proprietary and it makes sense for the business. But it's a very different place, even for me, as I compare to 5 or 10 years ago. And it wasn't to say 5 or 10 years ago was terrible. It was just different. It's this now more services-led world. You are pulling together lots of different parts of code or practices that seem to be working, or relating to others, so that you are operating in the same space. Might as well talk the same talk. There's a lot of things that get blended together for the benefit of the end user experience. And some of that goes into design, some of it goes into development, certainly plays into our marketing. And back to the channels distribution, we are so appreciative of when partners and sometimes competitors who are partners have a message that we can co-opt on, and go to market in a similar fashion, or at least in a parallel fashion.
Right. Well, and I think that's the difference there. It's not that you're, co-opting or you're stealing their messaging around that. Again, if your focus is on the customer, on the end user, and solving the problem, and that, just be open about, and here's the part that we bring, here's the part that Microsoft brings as a partner, we bring this, Microsoft brings this piece, this is what you need to go do on your own. Be open with people about that. I think it was it Mr. Kruger's Christmas or something like that. That was the movie I was thinking of. You know the one I'm talking about?
I was just gonna go with Home Alone, just so I could do this.
Yeah.
I was gonna say it was, every time a bell rings, Christian sings or something like that.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I don't know about that. Yeah, but I think I really liked, and I reference this a lot, when Satya became CEO. His first keynote was at the partner conference. What was that, 4 years ago now?
Mm-hmm.
And just to very roughly paraphrase around that, he said kind of an updated version of, our goal is we're going to build the best software in the world as Microsoft, but where we don't have the best solution or any solution, we will partner, we will integrate, so that, and then he went on to talk about the One Microsoft, and it was kind of the beginning of that movement.
Yep.
Of, to I guess, supplant the old battling business units model, where you had, a lot of people don't know this too about internally, and maybe this is still true to some extent, but there would be 2 or 3 or more, completely different initiatives, and they just like see who wins kind of thing. And it's, there are better ways to go and build some things, but anyway, it was, again,
I just want to put my least favorite saying, which is exactly how that was done in the past, was let 1,000 flowers bloom. And then you see which one grew the tallest, the fastest, and was the prettiest. And you're just like, oh my God, I can't believe that 3 teams are doing the exact same thing, and everybody's aware of it, and nobody's trying to bring these resources together. It used to drive me crazy.
I used to ask that question a lot, especially when we went through that period with the labs. I'd see really cool things that were done in more of an R&D mode, and say, like, are you aware that, like, the OneNote team has something similar to that?
Yep.
No, I had no idea. It's like,
oh boy. But I'll tell you, here are 2 examples, and this is really more back to partners. We recently have been doing a lot of work with Adobe, who, depending on how you look at them, sometimes we are partners and sometimes we're a little bit in competition. But from a OneDrive and a SharePoint perspective, if you store primarily PDFs, which a lot of people do, it's a huge part of what's stored in our cloud. And we, for a while, had kind of a lesser than experience when you wanted to move from a view the PDF to edit it. So we've gotten some flack for that. But in working closely with them, we now have a really great experience where you can view the PDF, and as you move into an edit motion, they now have some really nice web-based technology that's actually integrated in when you go to open in essentially their web-based PDF editor, or if you want to take that to the next step to do something with Acrobat on your desktop. So that's one nice example where we really partnered closely with them to the benefit of everybody, so that they could put their best foot forward. We could stop, having this lesser than experience for people actually downloading out of the service, which is the very wrong method. We want to keep that file in place. The other thing we've recently done is with Samsung, which has not always been a competitor, but they represent the face of Android when it comes to mobile.
Mm-hmm.
And we've partnered with them a number of times, and most recently, this really nice first a tier 1 experience of OneDrive, not only installed by default, but actually backing up your photos from the Samsung Gallery, which is a pretty tier 1 app that they manage, to then have that backed up by OneDrive. That's a recent announcement. And further work in how we're shipping and having great experiences on day one that you need to sign up into if you have the service or not. But to be there and be present, to at least be a side-by-side and have options, is something that we've worked really hard, with Samsung to do. But at the same time, remember, that's Android. We're pretty available on all platforms, and really working hard to have a good first-run experience, but not have it be Windows. We have great Windows experiences, but that was an Android example.
I didn't look for the Samsung connection to this, but when the announcement was made of that new feature, and I know this is outside of your area, but aware of, where you could take a picture of a table or graph in a table in a book, and then paste that into Excel, the mobile app, and it would convert it into a table right there.
Yeah.
Incredible. It was first only available in the Android app. And when that was announced, people were like, what the,
Hey, you got to start somewhere. The thing that maybe doesn't...
It's now supported in iPhone, by the way, for folks that are wondering. It's there. So.
Yeah. The reality, though, of when you actually start to think and ask those questions to the engineering team, like, why not both and everything at the same time? The reality is some of this is newer tech, or they're redesigning it in a way, or it's just innovative, like that one particular feature. And if they do it for both at the same time and they don't get it quite right, some of the shared code between the two, which is really our service on the back end, there's one pathway to learn once and then duplicate versus do in parallel and have to restructure if you need to. And we've done that with the SharePoint app, the OneDrive app. It'll first come to one or the other platforms. And it used to be mostly first to iOS, but now Android has such a great, not only Android phones out there compared to iPhones, they're pretty competitive as far as the device themselves, but our apps actually being used on both is pretty, significantly high numbers on both. So you still choose one over the other, even though we always try to showcase the intent is to, of course, just to be everywhere.
I put that in the same category of, you hear about some new cool feature. If you're on the other platform, if you're doing that, it's a true MVP. It's that initial thing. It's not yet ready for prime time. It's kind of like, with any new feature that's going, directly to the service, and when's it going to hit my tenant? It's never fast enough. You hear about something and people either freak out like, whoa, you're changing the way that I know the world, or it just can't get there fast enough.
You want to see what it looks like? The faces that I usually get when people ask me that question, this is what they look like. When's it coming to my tenant? And of course, we have a better answer than we've ever had, but it's still, a matter of timing, and not to be cheeky about it, but I always think, gosh, we've come such a long way from shipping things every 3 years.
Yeah.
And it even gives me pain to think, man, imagine in that 3-year cycle, we had a year of planning, a year of testing, and then a year of essentially baking it to roll it out. If you had a particular feature that you wanted or you're waiting for that didn't get called out to say it was going to be in this next release, that's it for years. You're just talking, okay, they're not going to do that for quite some time. Now, at least you can hear twice a year, big disclosures, big announcements, most of it rolled out within a 4 to 6 month window. Some of them are longer dig projects, but a lot lesser than 3 years, usually under a year. We really target from what we are willing to disclose, that 4 to 6 months from disclosure.
Well, it's it's a lot more frequent than just the twice a year around that. There's a constant breakneck speed at which innovation is coming out. Now, of course, that's across all of the various applications and microservices that are within Office 365 and the Office suite and Windows. And all the mobile capability. I mean, if you're using Dynamics, I mean, there's just so much news coming across those things. And if you're using everything, it's a lot of information that you're consuming on a monthly basis. It is. And
yep. Yeah. It's interesting when you talk to small to mid-size IT, that's nothing to be defined except for they just don't have as many people on the payroll. When it comes to delegating these different admin roles, or business owners that, sort of shape how it is we're going to use X or Y. And better than me, those conversations you walk into, and sometimes it's in parallel. There are many projects going on. And sometimes there's just a more serial approach, because you have to start with X, make Active Directory happy and healthy, and your march to the cloud will be good. And then what's next, and what's next, and what's next. And when you've got then different business units, either hiring partners or working with IT, the bigger the organization, the more typically you can do in parallel.
Right.
But the same thing is true, whether it's one person or 10 people or 100 people, with good and allocation and delegation, that still lots of news. If it's just for one person, then that certainly is overwhelming.
No longer, the size of an organization does not dictate the complexity of what you're trying to accomplish anymore.
Very true.
You have a 10, 20 person organization and be fully in with every aspect of what the Microsoft offers, to go in there and truly create that that transformational intelligent workplace model.
Yep.
And automate everything, and be just as complex as if you were a 5,000 person organization.
Yep.
Maybe slightly less data that's captured than a 5,000 person organization, but that may not even be true, depending on what the business does.
We see gigabytes and terabytes and zettabytes and big bytes all over the place, and sometimes surprising when you look at the seat count. We usually don't have great visibility beyond what is the amount of content being stored per a tenant. Abstracted, we don't know, we know who they are, but not necessarily what the content is, of course.
Right.
And you look at then the number of seats that they have licensed, which is just a way for us to understand, is this a big, small, medium? And then you look at it, and sometimes it's pretty straightforward. Small is small and big is big, but sometimes super big is really small, and vice versa.
Right.
And at the same time, the value of the service is how it can scale based on what they use, more so than in the past, based on what they actually use, not based on this guess of an allocation.
Right. Yeah, that was the death knell for a lot of the early version of what is now Office 365 was. People would be shocked at the server footprint that we would have to go and deploy, because we just didn't have the way to dynamically scale that once they were live, and we had to have the system able to scale based on that high rate of concurrency around certain activities and kind of everything else that's involved with that. And so it was a different world. That was a decade ago, 15 years ago.
Yep.
What it is today. But now it's more and more organizations, it's like they're cloud first as they're starting up. There's not a need in most cases to go and host anything on-prem and do everything from the services model. It's very exciting. I find that I'm not having to go in and do that argue that install locally, license it, that kind of that licensing model versus the evergreen model, where initially you had people say, well, look, I bought Microsoft Office Suite one time, I own that for 5 years, it's all I need kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Versus why am I paying now $100, $120 a year? But when you look at what's involved, how much that is being updated, all that does, it licenses the multiple devices, all that kind of stuff. Now, why would you ever go and buy that package solution?
Yeah, I mean, I think the options are always out there because sometimes it's not a cost issue. It's regulatory or data sovereignty, or we hear a lot of things, and some of it is just a matter of time. We can't get to the cloud fast enough.
Right.
But the cloud has been ready and is more ready, and we're doing everything we can to help people get there. And once they're there, for it to be a great experience. And the other benefit, that we're not shipping things every 3 years, is things get tweaked and fixed very quickly, so that it makes it a better user experience, but also makes it so that we're able to scale. We're more performant. We're more responsive. Both in mobile and web. And there's been a lot of innovation there. There's also just been a lot of catch up. Like, what does the internet expect? Granted, we're focused on just the intranet or the extranet. But the end user experience, the perspective and the requirements are, a higher bar than they used to be. And so hopefully you could attest to this. You've seen SharePoint grow up. You've seen OneDrive grow up. Some of these new services, where they start is certainly not at the level of what you might have thought in the past, but right in the middle, and they tweak and tune to make their performance better. But a lot of it is just scale and numbers. It used to be really hard to reach an entire organization of X number from the whatever server farm you'd establish. Anytime you wanted to go bigger, go more, that was a big investment, not just of cost and time, but to have that be properly tuned so that it was a good offering to the rest of the company. Now, we've been at scale for quite some time, and we host, onesie twosie size tenants, all the way up to hundreds of thousands of people in a tenant, all very active on both ends of the spectrum. And outside of, with really big deals, and some of them, being government oriented, some of them being just really large enterprises, we're pretty involved to make sure that they have a great experience on day one, because there are certain things that we can do, knowing if a big deal's been signed. But outside of that, it's pretty self-service and self-regulating, and if not heavily monitored, so that we can see things before they happen. And that's really fascinating. We did an episode on the podcast all about just data centers,
Yeah.
and there was 3 parts to it. There was the data center itself. How are we innovating at the data center layer, which is these huge, big buildings that kind of hum on their own. Down to the investments that we make, so that we're projecting ahead how much storage, how many servers, how many whatever, and down into that layer that we now call SharePoint Online. But what is that plethora of services that surrounds it, so that in and out of the data center is a great experience when SharePoint is hosted for you in Microsoft 365.
Is building 11 torn down yet? That's coming down, isn't it?
I feel like everything's been torn down. I stare at my window, and I'm waiting for the bulldozer to come to building 3.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you look out from building 3, building 4 is still there, but everything to essentially, the 20s has been pretty much demolished.
Yeah. So I was in 11 for a while, and that's why I brought that up. That was where the old NOC, the Network Operating Center, in the early days was. I think it then moved over to Red West from there. I can't remember. But yep. It's back in that era. Of course, I worked in that space for many, many years, and was into the whole data warehousing scene. All the cool kids were doing it. So
yeah, of course.
But
that's where Bill started too. Back to Bill.
That's right. Yeah. So it's that's why. Yeah, Bill and I were peers in that team when I joined Microsoft. So it was that whole people that don't know that history, but it was Microsoft managed solutions. It was spun out of Microsoft IT, but MMS was the precursor to BPOS, which was Business Productivity Online Services, which became Office 365. So
that's right. And I think the first customer, you can tell me if you remember this as well,
I do.
That this was just Bill telling me stories, of old. But I think our first customer that I can say, because it was public at the time, was Energizer.
Correct.
They were one of our first, what we at the time, called hosted cloud. But that was MMS. They were one of the first dedicated companies that is still with us, and just got transitioned over into the multi-tenant space, because we've done that now with all of our dedicated customers. So
I've not seen. So Dave Walsh was my GM, and they owned all of that. So when I hired them, so he was the guy that hired me, and I saw him in Dublin at ESPC a year and a half ago, and was it a year? Yeah, and so the almost 2 years. And so I've not seen him since then, but I asked him about a bunch of the clients. I managed a couple relationships there. I had customer number 2 was one of mine on the SharePoint side, which
Awesome.
I can't talk about, but yeah, we had some issues in the early days, but and he said, oh yeah, there's a lot of these, a group of small number of them that are still there. And he talked about, Microsoft was moving towards this, a lot of the multi-tenancy, issues that were holding them within that environment. So I'd be interested to talk to him today and see if they're all now off that old platform. And
yeah, they were given a pretty significant heads up, but our goal was to get them intact into the multi-tenant space. They would be a larger tenant within that multi-tenant space, the same as Microsoft is, a larger tenant within the multi-tenant space. And there's ways to, put people in the right place that makes it's mostly for us easier to get them the features they were begging for that were only released to multi-tenant versus dedicated. But at the same time, also just the service itself now treats them as any other tenant when it comes to health, reliability, backup, security. It's no longer this weird silo that we kind of have to maintain at an additional cost and resources.
Right. That was I tell you, that was a
customers.
Heck of a deal for those clients that were on that where they had Microsoft essentially running their IT.
Yep. Dedicated support, dedicated hardware management, it was at a cost. And for them now, that's also a less of a cost as we move them over to the multi-tenant space. But, they actually were very similar to our on-prem customers that were asking, when is this cloud feature going to come to me? They were very on-premises oriented, even though it was a hosted model. So anyway, good news all around, and getting them intact also meant some new features to the multi-tenant space, some of which haven't yet hit scale. They've sort of stayed with those customers because our promise to them was not to backtrack any features. But there are a couple that will come relatively soon or have already dropped that were based on the work that we had already done at the sort of farm level administration. Now, moving in things like, I think site URL rename was kind of a common action, when you think of I'm just administering SharePoint in a dedicated fashion, AKA on premises. That's not necessarily a new thing that you can do with SharePoint, but very new in the multi-tenant space.
Right.
It was cool to show that off and, kind of see maybe a forcing function of why we got that feature, but at the same time, it's so well received. It's a great thing for us to then go and build at scale.
Yep. For sure. Well, Mark, hey, really appreciate your time today and kind of going through, give some of the history and your history. People want to find out more about you, contact you, follow you, all those kinds of things. What are the best ways to reach you?
Yeah, I'm active on Twitter. So if you just go to @mkashman with a K, MKASHMAN, I usually am touting some things about SharePoint with the occasional bad pun. I got a decent LinkedIn updated profile.
Bad puns, Mark, come on.
Frequent. Okay, I try to keep them at least sort of fun and clever.
I noticed that Teeper was talking about, and he even said, he referred to, he's like, that's kind of like one of those Kashman puns.
That's right. That's right. I never know if that's a good or a bad thing, but I'll take it as anything from Jeff is always meant to be in the positive. So,
yeah.
But on LinkedIn, updated my profile since we acquired them and have been a little bit more active there. And then primarily through both the OneDrive and the SharePoint community blogs, of which you can always find just by going to aka.ms/SharePoint/blog or aka.ms/OneDrive/blog. And myself and a lot of other people publishing all of the news and updated information with customer case studies and opinions and whatnot. So that's where I'm most active, in those 3 places.
And of course, as you mentioned towards the beginning, you can find your weekly episodes of the Intro Zone. Is that correct?
That's right. We're commonly bi-weekly, but really 3 times a month because we do the bonus episode.
That's right.
And so definitely check out the Intro Zone, aka.ms/the Intro Zone. And it's myself and Chris McNulty co-hosting it, usually with 1 or 2 guests per episode, and we cover a broad spectrum of the intelligent intranet powered by SharePoint.
And it's, as I mentioned, there's a great one that's out there, episode 36. That's the FAQs, which is
Just the facts.
Just the facts. That's right. Which is the panel of engineering leads and stuff that was from the SharePoint conference in May in Las Vegas. So definitely go check it out as well. So
yeah. Thank you for the time. Thanks for obviously this great episode and offering, and for all the work that you do.
Assuming it's great because you were on it. That's like, wow,
I don't mean just me. I mean the chat series. You're doing a great job with the chat series, and of course CollabTalk. And anytime you have something that you want to share, we'll help amplify it. How about that?
Yeah. No. Thanks for participating over the years. So, and we'll see you on the next one.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Talk to you later.